All ports are cargo ports, even the ones with welcome drinks and steel drums. The only difference is the kind of cargo being unloaded. Sometimes it's fruit, or corn, or children's toys, sometimes it's fuel, and sometimes it's 2,000 people in floral shirts looking for the nearest public Wi-Fi. But long before souvenir shops and sunburns, ports were the places of survival, hubs for food, tools, building supplies, and the heart of communities. And they weren't carved into coastlines either. The first ports were nestled along rivers, the Tigris, the Nile, the Yangtze. Rivers were the highways of the ancient world, and civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient China built entire economies around these watery trade routes. In fact, the earliest known port ever discovered is Lothal, which is in present-day Gujarat in India, about 18 kilometers inland from the Gulf of Cumbat, which is within the Arabian Sea. That port can be dated back almost 5,000 years to around 2,400 BCE. Part of the Indus Valley civilization, Lothal had a carefully engineered dockyard with stone-paved warehouses and a basin that connected directly to an ancient river. Small, flat-bottomed boats, perfect for navigating the shallow, silty river channels, would arrive from other Indus Valley cities or sail in from the Arabian coast. They were likely made of wood sealed with bitumen, powered by poles or sails when the winds allowed. Now, the boats might sound rudimentary, but they carried goods that were anything but primitive. Carnelian beads, finely crafted in Lothal's workshops, were a prized export bound for Mesopotamia. Other outgoing cargo included cotton textiles, ivory, pottery, copper tools, and semi-precious stones. Incoming boats might carry timber from Gujarat's forests, or tin, or dates from as far as Afghanistan or Oman. And this was very much the precursor to the giant container ports that we've sometimes docked at this voyage. Except the systems and efficiencies built into modern megaports weren't there yet. Unloading was done by hand, with workers forming human chains from the boat to the warehouse. Goods were stored in stone-paved warehouses nearby, which were raised to stop and prevent them from flooding. And traders used bullock carts on packed earthen roads to transport their goods to or from the port. Now, there's no evidence of written cargo logs, though perhaps clay seals were used to mark who owned what cargo. And of course, there were no port schedules either. People just watched the tides, they kept an eye on the horizon, and they stayed attuned of the rhythm of trade cycles. That was about 5,000 years ago. And somewhat remarkably, there are still ports around the world that work pretty much like that today. Up and down the Amazon River, for example, loose cargo is packed into the lower decks of recreo boats while passengers swing and socialize in their hammocks on the above decks. When the boat arrives in a port, a combination of tuk-tuks, scooters, cars, and trucks swarm around the dock, picking up whatever it was that they came for. Car tires, grain, birthday presents for the kids. Amazon Prime works a little differently in the actual Amazon. You might not have thought about it so much when we tended into Parintins, but that was, just as legitimately as Buenos Aires, a cargo port. Anyway, back for a moment to ancient times. Trade was expanding, and so as shipbuilding evolved and coastal navigation improved, maritime trade pushed beyond the rivers and out into the open sea. By about 1200 BCE, Phoenician traders were crossing the Mediterranean, carrying cedarwood, glass, wine, and Tyrian purple dye, which was a luxury product made from sea snails. It was so prized that it became the color of royalty. Anyway, They established trading posts all along the coast, from modern-day Lebanon to Spain, and they helped lay the foundations for seaborne commerce across the ancient world. By the 15th century, European powers were sending caravels across the Atlantic and around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. This time, they were carrying guns, spices, textiles, silver, enslaved people, and printed Bibles, commodities of empire, conquest, and commerce, shaping the early contours of global trade. Now, the cargo may have changed, but the fundamentals remained the same. To use enslaved people as an example, just to demonstrate how the system really didn't differentiate cargo from cargo. They were listed on manifests by number, not by name. They were packed into holds with the same grim detachment as sugar or cotton. They were valued by weight, costed by the voyage, insured against loss. If someone died en route, it was recorded as spoilage. The port, the ship, the paperwork, none of it made a distinction between a human being and a barrel of rum. And it was around this time that countries were starting to make serious money from international shipping. But journeys were slowing down the cash flow, and pirates were making longer journeys riskier. So two shortcuts in particular set about changing that. Two monumental canals. First, the Suez Canal opened in 1869, sliced 7,000 kilometers off the journey between Asia and Europe. And then, in 1914, the Panama Canal allowed ships to bypass the treacherous Cape Horn. Now, these weren't just engineering marvels. They reshaped global trade routes. They made it faster, cheaper, and more predictable to move goods across the world's oceans. The Panama Canal opened just over a century ago. And yet, still, even at relatively recent comparatively, cargo ports operated much as they had in those ancient river ports. Goods had to be loaded and unloaded, one box, barrel, or bag at a time. And given that in the early 20th century, around 80% of all international trade was transported by ship, this was a real constraint on economic growth. Ships were getting larger and faster, but the process at either end, loading or unloading, was still painfully manual. A dock worker might handle hundreds of separate items a day, each one requiring paperwork, inspection, and careful stowage. It could take days, sometimes weeks, to fully load or unload a ship, especially if the cargo was mixed. That really slowed things up. Coal, coffee, machine parts, bags of flour. And every hour that a ship sat in port, it cost money, a lot of money. So while steam power had revolutionized speed and canals had shortened the distance, the bottleneck now was the dock itself. Ports couldn't keep up with the volumes of goods that industrialized economies needed to move. What was missing was standardization, a system. It was time to think inside the box. Yes, inside the box. Because what is the defining feature of cargo ports today? Huge cranes moving identically proportioned metal boxes from one tower to another. So how did we shift from the one-by-one loose cargo in the hold way of doing things to the mega container ports that have become the dominant image of merchant shipping today? Well, as with many innovations, it took an outsider to see the opportunity. In this case, it was a truck driver called Malcom McLean. Now, in the 1930s, Malcom McLean drove a truck around North Carolina, hauling fuel and cotton bales. I'm not sure anyone could have guessed the impact that this man would have on the global economy. Anyway, as his trucking business started to take off, McLean was becoming increasingly frustrated with the inefficiencies of port logistics as they were at the time. It frustrated him to see his trucks being unloaded item by item into a processing facility to be sorted, checked, and then painstakingly reloaded onto a ship. Cargo was being pinched, other things were getting damaged by the constant toing and froing, and so in short, there had to be a better way. And McLean's idea was beautifully simple. What if you could just load the entire trailer, or at least the cargo container from it, directly onto the ship? No repacking, no double handling, just lift and stack. Nice idea, huh? And for most people, that would have been where it ended. A scribbled line in a notebook that says, someone should invent this. Well, Malcom McLean didn't leave the idea in his notebook. This one-time trucker who now owned and managed a fleet of vehicles went out and bought a rusting oil tanker called the Ideal X. He took it to dry dock and he refitted it with a flat deck and loaded 58 custom-built containers, each 33 feet long, onto it. The year was 1956. Ideal X became the first container ship in the world. And almost no one noticed, and even fewer cared. But McLean knew he was onto something. His single ship sailed from Newark, New Jersey to Houston, Texas, and it slashed loading costs by 97%. And this cannot be overstated. This was revolutionary. How other shipping companies didn't realize this at the time is baffling. Let's break this down a bit. Before shipping containers became a thing in the late 1950s, cargo handling, loading, and unloading of a ship could represent up to 60% of the total costs of that ship's journey, especially on shorter voyages. Often, cargo handling costs exceeded the fuel costs, and it completely dwarfed the costs associated with paying the crew. Getting stuff on and off a ship could take weeks, and it cost a lot of money. Now, according to shipping historian Mark Levinson, manual loading cost an average of $5.83 per ton. But when the Ideal X made her maiden voyage in 1956, she loaded 58 containers carrying the equivalent of 600 tons of cargo in just 7 hours. How much did that cost per ton? 16 cents. If you could make a 97% efficiency saving in your business while also speeding up delivery of your product to your customers and minimizing the risk of damage and theft, you'd do it, right? Well, back in the 1950s, the world's merchant fleet moved hundreds of millions of tons of cargo per year. Collectively, we're talking about billions of dollars being saved every year. So why didn't everyone else jump at the opportunity? What was stopping them? In a word, infrastructure, or more accurately, lack of it. You see, the genius of the shipping container wasn't really the steel box. It was the system that had to be built around it. Cranes that could lift the containers, ships that could carry them, trucks and trains that could handle their dimensions, and then ports that could coordinate it all. And in the 1950s, none of that existed yet. The standard ports of the day were designed for manual labor. They had teams of longshoremen, warehouses, and equipment for bags, barrels, and crates, not for 33-foot-long steel rectangles. Most port authorities were deeply entrenched in old systems, unionized labor, and fixed contracts. Changing that meant massive upfront investment and breaking with decades, actually centuries, of practice. And then there was the human side. Dock worker unions were understandably hostile. Containerization meant fewer hands needed on deck, literally. In some cases, container ports reduced the number of workers per ship from hundreds to just a few dozen. And that represented not just job losses, but an existential threat to communities that were built around port labor. Even among shipping companies, there was hesitation. Standardizing container sizes meant cooperation across rival firms, with governments, with railroads, many of whom had zero incentive to work together. And that's not even counting the bureaucrats and the custom officials who had to be persuaded that a sealed box was secure and could be trusted not to smuggle contraband. So the industry didn't say no, it said not yet. What it needed was a crisis, or at least a really big headache to force a rethink. And that headache arrived in the sweltering jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War changed the fortunes of McLean's big idea, and with it, the future of global trade. By the mid-1960s, the United States was deep into one of the most logistically complex military operations in modern history. Supplying hundreds of thousands of troops with everything from ammunition and helicopters to socks and spam required a supply chain that could stretch across the Pacific and still function under pressure. But traditional cargo methods were a total disaster. Cargo ships sat for weeks off the coast of Vietnam, waiting to be unloaded. At ports like Cam Ranh Bay and Saigon, there simply weren't enough docks. There weren't enough cranes. There weren't enough workers to handle the endless stream of pallets, boxes, and barrels. Stuff went missing, supplies rotted on the docks, and at one point it was taking an average of 92 days to deliver a shipment from the US to the front line. And that was just for basic goods. So the military turned to containerization. Sealand, which was McLean's company, was contracted to carry US military cargo in containers sealed in the US, shipped across the Pacific, and opened only when they reached secure military logistics hubs. No repacking, no loss, no mess. And it worked. And once it worked in a war zone, the civilian shipping world finally took notice. By the late 1960s, Sealand and a few other early adopters were running regular container services between the US and Asia. Port cities that wanted to stay relevant, New York, Rotterdam, Singapore, began tearing out their old piers and building container terminals. Ships got bigger, cranes got taller, and ports became highly automated hubs of precision and speed. Containerization was no longer a theory, it was the proven solution. And by the 1970s, it was transforming not just ports, but entire economies, ushering in an era of global manufacturing and just-in-time delivery that underpins the world we live in today. But I'm willing to bet that many people in the room had never heard of Malcom McLean until today. We've all heard of Bill Gates, of Elon Musk, of Warren Buffett. We tend to ogle and idolize these high priests of capitalism who make huge fortunes from their genius ideas or out of the ordinary business acumen. So why have so few people ever heard of Malcom McLean? This is a man who changed the way the world works just as monumentally as Bill Gates did when he launched Microsoft 50 years ago as a Harvard dropout. Why don't we know who he is when it was his blue sky thinking that facilitated Jeff Bezos' meteoric rise with the next day Amazon deliveries of almost anything from almost anywhere? Did he not cash in on his invention? Well, he did. Malcom McLean made and lost a fortune. In 1969, just over a decade from his first foray into container shipping, he had convinced the world's major ports to modernize and transition to use his new container system. So he decided to sell up. He sold his company, Sealand, to R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco giant. They bought it for $160 million, which today would be over $1.2 billion. At the time, it was one of the biggest corporate deals in US history. He emerged a winner, a huge payout, including cash and stock, a seat on the board of R.J. Reynolds, and let's not forget, the recognition of having built the first truly modern container shipping line. It was a big deal, but he didn't retire rich. McLean later tried to re-enter the industry with United States lines, aiming to apply containerization to long-haul global routes with new, massive econ ships. But in a classic case of overexpansion, the company took on too much debt to finance these new supersized ships, and at just the same time as rising fuel prices and a subsequent slowing in global trade, it was just bad luck in a way. But the company couldn't continue to pay its bills. And so in November of 1986, American Lines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which was the largest bankruptcy in maritime history at that time. McLean did enjoy one final chapter of success in the early 1990s, now well into his 70s, when he launched one last venture called Trailer Bridge, which is a container shipping company focused on routes between the US mainland and Puerto Rico. And Trailer Bridge is still operating today. But its founder, the man who invented container shipping, died in 2001, consigned to a few economic textbooks. It amazes me that this man, through one bright idea, inspired by efficiency and simplification, a man who really and truly changed the way the world works, is totally anonymous to almost the entirety of humanity. And there's nothing wrong with success in anonymity. His legacy isn't being famous, nor, as far as I can tell, was that ever his goal. He set out to change the way the world did business, and he most certainly did that. In 2000, Fortune magazine named him Man of the Century for his impact on global trade. So to round up today's mosey into the world of modern container ports, how do they actually work? What is the step-by-step of an efficient McLean container port where everything is in just the right place at just the right time? And how am I supposed to know what's inside each container in each patiently waiting tower on the dockside? Well, let's follow the journey of a container through a modern container port. So first of all, our container arrives on a colossal ship, maybe 400 meters long, stacked like a floating game of Tetris. A modern typical container ship can carry up to 24,000 containers. But don't panic, they're not guessing which bot goes where. Each container is digitally logged and mapped before it ever hits the high seas. And ships follow a precise stowage plan, like a seating chart for steel boxes. Just as we have a system that we know exactly who's in which stateroom, cargo ships have the same for knowing which container is where. Now the second stage, the docking, is more like a dance of the cranes. The ship pulls up to the quay, and these giant gantry cranes, some of them up to 130 meters tall, get to work. Now these cranes are operated by humans, but they are usually aided by automatic systems and sensors. And each crane moves just one container at a time, about one every 2 minutes, placing them neatly on the dock, not randomly, but in a pre-arranged spot. How do they know? Every container has that tracking number and barcode, or nowadays often it's an RFID chip, that links it to a global database, so you could track your container all the way around the world. Next up, it's time for sorting, our robotic ballet. Once on land, the containers are moved by AGVs, which are automated guided vehicles, or straddle carriers. And no doubt you've seen these imports. These are enormous, driverless machines that scuttle around like well-trained beetles, hunched over, holding a container in its belly. And they take containers to temporary holding stacks in the yard, grouped by destination, priority, or custom status. And the port's logistics software knows exactly what is in each container, where it's going, when it needs to be picked up, and it is like a giant outdoor version of an Amazon warehouse, except every item weighs 20 tons. But how do the authorities know what's inside? Well, customs officials don't open every container. Instead, high-risk containers, usually flagged by intelligence services or nowadays increasingly artificial intelligence, go through X-ray scanners or sniffer tech. Only very few are physically inspected. The rest, well, trusted data from the shipping manifest does the job. And that manifest travels electronically from exporter to importer, so customs authorities pre-clear most shipments before they even arrive. This is all about efficiencies, remember. And finally, it is time for the container to be picked up. Once cleared, containers are loaded onto trucks or trains, again using cranes or automated stackers, and from there the box might head to a distribution center, it might head to a factory, maybe even directly into a retailer's loading bay. What a beautifully finessed system. It's a dance, it's fabulously choreographed, it's robots dancing. And it's all thanks to a man who took action on a passing idea from life on the road as a trucker. The Economist put it perfectly in Malcom McLean's obituary. He was not a shipper, but he revolutionized shipping. Not a port engineer, but he redesigned ports. Not a global economist, but he reshaped the global economy. It's no exaggeration to say that McLean was the quiet revolutionary behind the scenes of globalization. But actually, revolutionary as the modern container port may be, it's also evolutionary. Our ports have been defining our communities for millennia. They've never just been about cargo. They've been about connection. From the riverbanks of the Lothal to the megaports of Singapore, ports have always been where people meet the world, where ideas arrive, where cultures mix, where families send off loved ones and receive parcels from faraway lands. They're not just economic engines. They're emotional landmarks. You can tell the story of a civilization through its ports, what it valued, what it needed, what it hoped to trade for, and sometimes what it tried to escape. Ports aren't just places where journeys begin or end. They are, in a very real way, the pause between places at the same time. I always say that with cruise ships. When one group of people goes traveling, two groups of people go traveling. You're taking your culture on tour at the same time as experiencing someone else's. And that's why ports matter. So the next time you see a container port, don't just think of it as a heap of steel boxes or a tangle of cranes. Think of it as the latest chapter in a 5,000-year-old story. A story of trade and trust, of great economic and engineering inventions, but most of all, as a place where the world comes together and connects across time and space. Thank you.